people with the big bonuses. Private enterprise has screwed up. But don't worry. The Lone Ranger is coming to the rescue. Dressed as a bureaucrat. The government. We're going to bring in the government. And the government is going to control, to regulate, to change the taxes, to make sure that these nasty private entrepreneurs don't screw us around and don't make this kind of terrible thing. And we're going to get us out of the current mess they've made, and we're going to do it in such a way that we'll never have to face such a crisis again. That's a quote from Franklin Roosevelt. And that's a quote in slightly altered words from Barack Obama. And I could make the same quote from every president in the last 100 years. Each of them got us out of a crisis of private enterprise by bringing in the government. Each of them promised that that would not only get us out of the crisis, but prevent future crises. Given that we're living in a current crisis, clearly what they promised would never happen was a promise they could not and never have kept. No president has ever delivered on the promise that there'll be no more crisis. You know that because you're living in it. So in comes the government. It regulates, it controls. And then we have a different kind of capitalism for a while. Private enterprises are still there. The capitalist enterprises are still. There's still a board of directors. There's still the workers coming to work, producing a surplus. But now the government has got its fingers in there. It tells capitalists, you can do this, but not that. You have to do at least a little of that if you're going to do some of that. They control, they tax out of it. They really get in there. In some extreme cases, the government comes in even more. It doesn't just regulate. It doesn't just control. It says to the private enterprises, hold your breath. You're out of here. We're taking over the enterprises. They're not going to be private enterprises anymore. They're going to be state enterprises. Owned and operated by the government. As in Russia, China, Cuba, Nicaragua, and fill in the blank. Wow. Now guess what? Now we have a new kind of capitalism. Why do I keep calling it capitalism? Because the organization of the surplus hasn't changed very much. There's still a mass of people who go to work and produce a surplus that a small number of other people get and distribute. What has happened is that small number is either controlled and regulated by the government, or it is itself part of the government, state officials. But it doesn't change the internal structure of production. Wow. But our story is only halfway done. Every time this kind of state-regulated or state capitalism has replaced private capitalism, guess what? It has crises too. And sooner or later, it may get through a few small ones, but eventually they all have a big one. And then people go, hey, this system sucks. It's not producing, it's not fair, it's not bearable. And then the cry goes up, we don't want this system, and in come the capitalists, the regulating government, and they say, you know what the solution is? We need to, ready? Move from state capitalism to private capitalism. We need to privatize, to deregulate, get the government off our back. Let the private initiative of the individual entrepreneur do its thing, then carry us into prosperity. And lo and behold, the whole historical movement that went at first from private capitalism to state capitalism makes the happy trip back. And after another 10 or 20 years, we do it all again. As we have in every capitalist country on earth. In the 1920s, we had a private capitalism in America. It collapsed in 1929, and then came state-regulated capitalism. It lasted from roughly the 1930s to the 1970s, a long time. Had real crises along the way, but it lasted. By the 1970s, it had such a big crisis that we said, this system sucks, and we brought in a transition back to private capitalism. Ronald Reagan. Yeah, we had that for 20, 30 years, and then the system bonked, and now Mr. Obama is taking us back to state intervention capital. In Russia, a private capitalism at the end of the 19th century. With the opening of the 20th century, they have a crisis to beat all crises. A depression, a war, a civil war, and a revolution. All in a few years. That's rough. So they have, predictably, an extreme reaction against private capitalism. They have state capitalism set up. The state literally takes over. And they do an extraordinary job. But by the 1970s, they do hit a crisis. They can't resolve it. And what's the solution? Private capitalism again. And if you take a look at who the key private capitalists are today in Russia, they are all people who occupied the exact same position in the hierarchy of the Soviet Union before. That's how they became the top private. It's the same people, which shouldn't surprise you. Here in the United States, it's the same people. Larry Summers, the chief economic advisor to Obama, made his career in the 80s and 90s being the champion of private capitalism. And today, he is leading Obama as the champion of state capitalism. Hello, off one hat. And I don't mean to pick on Larry Summers. I enjoy picking on him, but that's not what my point is. The truth of it is, though, that his switching of his position is normal, is widespread. It's not unique to him at all. Capitalism is very comfortable. You didn't need to have a terribly bloody revolution in Russia in 1990. What for? It's not a revolution from one class structure to another. It's a revolution from one form of capitalism to another, from the private to the state. And that oscillation back and forth is characteristic of every other capitalist country too. Latin America was in a very state-controlled economic development program, say from the end of World War II to around the 70s. Then in the 1970s, Latin America shifted over and became private enterprise. And when that hit a stone wall about the turn of the century, for the last 10 or 15 years, we've had Latin America moving back to state capitalism, championed by Chavez and the others. Now, why do I say this troubling thing by referring to Russia and China and Chavez? I don't mean to put them down. I don't mean to deny in any way the popular democratic impulses that are part of them. Just as I'm not putting down the Russian workers who made their great revolution, which I admire. I am pointing out to you, though, that these people, what all their good intentions were, and Marx always talked about the good intentions of the people he was trying to bring his analysis to. If you don't have in your mind an understanding of the organization of surplus and its role in a social change, then you're not going to attend to it. You're not going to do it. You're going to think socialism is about bringing the government in, having the government control, having planning by the government instead of the market, having government-owned productive property rather than if that's your frame of reference, then you're going to be one of the many socialists who did the work, often the foot soldiers of the transition from private capitalism to state capitalism, were leftists who were caught up in the process, believing and hoping, honestly, that it was a way station to socialism. And it wasn't, because that wasn't the point of it. It is a way station to handle the crises that capitalism cannot escape. And if you can't escape a crisis, you better develop a mechanism for managing it. And that's what capitalism did in this endless oscillation between the private and the state form. Yeah?
I don't want to go off too much on a tangent, but there are certain things that under state capitalism, I'm just thinking about England in the 70s with the destruction of the miners and the destruction of
city council governments.
Those things sometimes the cycle doesn't continue, it just stops. I'm just thinking about the miners, it stops. And benefits under state capitalism just end when it's destroyed by Thatcher or whatever it is. So I guess my question is that it does seem like there are moments that state capitalism in some ways has to be defended because it ends.
Sure. Oh, yes. I agree with you. If I were a politically active person at a time when state capitalism was under the gun, say in the 1970s and 80s, which I did that, we fought to hold on to it, to hold on to the government benefits, to prevent the decimation of regulations and all of that. Sure we did. It's not a question of whether you fight, that's clearly you have to. It's a question of how you fight. Do you fight for the state capitalism as the goal, the end, what you're after? Or do you fight for it while exposing it as a form of capitalism that we have to go beyond in order to secure them? Let me do this another way to get at your question. Every time capitalism oscillated from a private form to a state form, and every time that happened, socialists and communists and Marxists and radicals got involved, seeing the role of the government as at least a way station in the direction they were going. Here's what happened, practically happened. The government came in and it regulated, all right, it did. And it controlled, and it provided government services for people, subsidized housing, education, transportation, all kinds of minimum wages, all kinds of things, unemployment insurance, social security here in the United States. Always that was done in those moments. But what the reforms never did, and here's how it's a question of how you fight. What those reforms never did was to attack the organization of the enterprise. What Marx means by class structure. You always leave intact a small group of people who gather their surplus into their own hands. Now, the regulations and the rules and the taxes impinge on them. You're taking the taxes from them. You're limiting their freedom of action with regulations. So what the hell do you expect? If you impose rules and regulations on a group of people who rather not have them, they're going to fight you about them. And so as soon as you put in a regulation, they go to work to undermine it, to evade it, to destroy it. What's worse, a board of directors of a corporation, a capitalist, isn't just the person who doesn't like the reforms that are imposed on him. He's the person who gets into his hands the surplus of society. Therefore, he is in a position to have the resources to achieve his goal. By leaving those people in place, by not having a surplus analysis, you made sure your enemies were intact to destroy you, and then you wonder why you're destroyed. What? Look at it now. The government put restrictions on Goldman Sachs, on Citibank, on Bank of America, on Merrill Lynch, and you can read in the financial press every day that they use the money from the government to do the lobbying to make sure that the rules the government wanted to go with the money don't apply. Come on. What are we looking at? You're looking at the same old story. The capitalist is in a position to have the incentive to undo state capitalism and the resources to achieve the goal. So they do. Corporations, if they're left the way they are going to